Welcome back to the Church and the World. This is the third of our three videos on economic life through the lens of the social statement of the ELCA, Sufficient Sustainable Livelihood for All. We've talked about who for all is and what in particular and what kinds of persons in particular we're very specifically concerned for, namely the poor, the disenfranchised, and marginalized. We've talked about livelihood and human dignity and vocation and work. And today we're going to talk about sufficiency and sustainability. Now, if those S's sound familiar to you, it's because you were here for our Creation Care series, where for 3 days we looked at the statement of the ELCA on caring for creation, for God's creation. And that also included ideas about sustainability and sufficiency. And just as we have already mentioned that some of what the government needs to do in terms of alleviating poverty is look at opportunities for women, family planning, availability of birth control and education, all of these things that have to do, a lot of which had to do with statements that were made in the abortion statement. Today, we're going to hear a lot of things that are at least tangentially related to caring for a sustainable creation, a sustainable planet, sufficiency and sustainability, and moreover, the fundamental belief and confession that we do not think those things are opposed. We believe that we can have a sufficient life as human beings without that life being unsustainable on this planet. We believe that we can have enough without having too much, right? We believe that we can actually be sustainable and sufficient simultaneously in our economic life together. So let's talk about how that works. Sufficiency means adequate access to income and other resources that enable people to meet their basic needs, which include nutrition, clothing, housing, health care, personal development, and participation in community with dignity. God has created a world of sufficiency for all, providing us daily and abundantly with all the necessities of life. In many countries, the problem is not the lack of resources, but how they are shared, distributed, and made accessible within society. Justice seeks fairness in how goods, services, income, and wealth are allocated among people so that they can acquire what they need to live. Okay, so this is always going to involve government. There's a paragraph here that I think you should hear. Yes. So human need and right to ownership are in tension with each other. We need to be aware of that tension and hold that tension without trying to dissolve it. Stewardship is the answer to it. This stewardship includes holding economic, political, and social processes and institutions responsible for producing and distributing what is needed for sufficiency for all. Private property is affirmed insofar as it serves a useful yet imperfect means to meet the basic needs of individuals, households, and communities. Note that the right to your property, right? Your holding of private property is affirmed as far as it serves as a means to meet the needs of individuals, households, and communities, right? The church does not believe in a fundamental or divine right to property. The church believes, I mean, sure, if that's how we want to structure society and it helps, fine. But when it fails to be a means that is useful to meet basic needs, then we have a problem and we need to reevaluate that. Okay, just want to be clear here about what this statement does and doesn't say. Government, meanwhile, is intended to serve God's purposes by limiting or countering narrow economic interests and promoting the common good. Paying taxes to enable government to carry out these and other purposes is an appropriate expression of its stewardship in society. It is not something to be avoided. Government often falls short of these responsibilities. Its policies can harm the common good, and especially the most vulnerable. Governing leaders are to be held accountable to God's purposes. Psalm 72:2. May they judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. May they defend the cause of the poor of the people. Government's for the poor, friends. It's supposed to be for the poor. If the poor are not being helped by the government has gone wrong. The lack of material sufficiency for some within the human community is itself a spiritual problem. We live separated from others on the basis of income and wealth and resent what others have. Huge disparities in income and wealth, such as those that we face in this country, threaten the integrity of the human community. Now, those who are rich and those who are poor are called into relationships of generosity from which each can benefit. Within the church, those in need and those with abundance are brought together in Christ. And on this basis, and in the face of disparities in the church of his day, Paul calls for a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need. In so doing, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. 2 Corinthians 8. So God's mandate is clear. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Isaiah 58. God's lavish justifying grace frees us from self-serving preoccupations and calls us to a life of mutual generosity as we relate to all who are our neighbors. Faith becomes active through personal relationships, direct assistance, and wider policy changes in society. Right? So for those situations where sufficiency is not attained, where there is not enough, okay? In the United States, this happens. Tens of millions of people live in poverty, even if they refuse to think of themselves as poor. People are making daily choices as to which necessities they will have to live without. Many work part or full-time, but on that basis are still unable to lift their families out of poverty, a violation, by the way, of what we've already talked about, and we'll talk about again, about wages. Others are physically or mentally unable to work, which, by the way, means that they shouldn't have to have a livelihood. See yesterday's video. Many lack the family, educational, and community support important for making good choices in their lives. This is a problem as well. See the first video. We're talking about for all and some systems of uplift that should be established by the society, especially through governmental channels and private channels. Now, although those living in poverty are particularly visible in cities, their more hidden reality in suburban, small town, and rural areas can be just as painful. A greater proportion of people of color live in conditions of poverty. The poor are disproportionately women with their children. Systemic racism and sexism continue to be evident in the incidence of poverty. I want you to note that this is 1999. Systemic racism and sexism continue to be evident in the incidence of poverty. For those who are hearing that talk about systemic racism or sexism is new, it is not. It is 20 plus years old, and the ALCA at the very minimum is actually considerably older than that. Okay, so poverty, not having enough, folks that don't have enough. In light of these realities, we commit ourselves as church and urge members to provide counsel, food, clothing, shelter, and money for people in need in ways that respect their dignity. We commit ourselves and urge members to develop mutual face-to-face empowering relationships between people who have enough and people living in poverty, especially through congregational and synodical partnerships. We commit ourselves as a church and urge members to advocate for public and private policies that effectively address the causes of poverty. We commit ourselves as a church and urge members to generously support organizations and community-based efforts that enable low-income people to obtain more sufficient, sustainable livelihoods. And we commit ourselves as a church and urge members to continue working to eradicate racism and sexism. Interesting. We also call on the wider society. We call for government to provide adequate income assistance and related services for citizens, documented immigrants and refugees who are unable to provide for their livelihood through employment. We call for adequate, consistent public funding for the various low-income services nonprofit organizations provide for the common good of all. We call for scrutiny to ensure that new ways of providing low-income people with assistance and services, such as through the private sector, does not sacrifice the most vulnerable for the sake of economic efficiency and profit. We call for the correction of regressive tax systems so that people are taxed progressively in relation to their ability to pay. We call for opposition to lotteries and other state-sponsored gambling because of how these regressive means of raising state revenues adversely affect those who are poor. Think about that. Do you live in a state with a lottery? I do. Do you live in a state where the tax system is not a progressive tax system based on how much money you might or might not have in terms of expendable income versus the absolute poverty minimum? Do you live in a place where you've seen a lot of investigation and policy change to provide low-income people with assistance and services, right? And do you see how that does not sacrifice the most vulnerable for the sake of economic efficiency and profit? Or do you see a lot of sacrificing the most vulnerable for efficiency in economics or for profit? Do you see adequate, consistent public funding for the various low-income services nonprofit organizations provide for the common good of all? Do you see the government providing adequate income assistance and related services for citizens, for documented immigrants, for refugees who are unable to provide for their livelihood through employment? Depends on where you are, but by and large, these are issues of extreme tension. And part of that is because of the political conversation and where we are at in this country around that. So that's where we stand as the ELCA around these questions. And we're going to talk more about this in a moment. We're still on sufficiency, so I'm going to hurry up here because we're moving pretty quickly through sufficiency. Okay, here we go. Sufficiency, too much. What do we do with the rich, right? And no, despite the popular meme, no, we're not going to eat the rich. Because most of us in the United States have far more than we need. Most of the people in the United States, can easily fall into bondage to what we have. We then become like the young man Jesus encountered, whose bondage to his possessions kept him from following Jesus. We consume goods and services to meet our needs, to increase consumption and expand sales. Businesses stimulate ever new wants. Sound familiar? Rather than human needs shaping consumption, advertising and media promotion both shape and expand wants. Our very being becomes expressed through what we have or desire to possess. When consuming to meet basic needs turns into consumerism, as an end in itself, we face a serious crisis of faith. Endless accumulation of possessions and pursuit of wealth can become our God, as we yearn for life without limits. In the United States, people's worth and value tend to be measured by the size of their income and wealth. If judged by their multi-million-dollar compensations, top corporate officers and sports superstars would seem to be the most highly valued people in our society. Enormous disparities between their compensations and the average wages of workers are scandalous. The economic power of large transnational corporations continues to grow, making some of them larger than many national economies. Along with this financial strength comes an inordinate potential to influence political decisions, local and regional economies, and democratic processes in society. The power they wield, enhanced through mergers and buyouts, can have positive effects, but it can also hold others captive to transnational corporate interests. The global community must continue to seek effective ways to hold these and other powerful economic actors more accountable for the sake of sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all. In light of these realities, we commit as a church and urge members to. So what are we going to do? We examine how we are in bondage to our possessions and can be freed to be faithful stewards of them. So we work on that principle and how we can kind of let go of the consumeristic tendencies that we've been filled with. We engage in serious and ongoing consideration in our families and congregations of how to resist the allure of consumerism, to live lives less oriented towards the accumulation of goods and financial assets. We commit to educate one another, beginning with the young, on how to deal responsibly with money, credit, and spending within one's means. We commit to give generously of our wealth, for example, through tithing and planned giving, especially for purposes that serve the needs of others, right? So a lot of that is kind of unburdening ourselves from the myths and values of the society that surrounds us and witnessing to a different way to exist in this culture. And we call for corporate policies that lessen the disparities between compensations of top corporate executives and that of the workers throughout an organization. So in other words, top executives and the bottom workers should be closer, right? The disparity should be less than it is. We call for corporate governance that is accountable for the effects of companies' practices on workers, communities, and the environment, here and throughout the world. Interesting. We call for scrutiny of the tax breaks, subsidies, and incentives many companies receive to assure that they serve the common good. We call for enforcement of laws to prevent the exercise of inordinate market power by large corporations. And we call for appropriate government regulatory reform so that governments can monitor private sector practices more effectively and efficiently in an ever-changing global economy. All of that should be basic boilerplate stuff, but think about that. Scrutinizing tax breaks, lessening disparities of income between the top earners and the bottom earners, corporate governance being accountable for practices in workers, communities, and environment, no matter where those effects may be being felt on Earth. This is serious stuff. And we haven't gotten although that does segue into sustainability. Sustainability of the environment, agriculture, and low-income communities. Now, this should, if you've been following us through our series on creation, this will not say, I suspect, anything shocking to you, right? Individuals and families should not borrow more than they are able to pay back and still meet their future needs. Governments should not finance their spending by excessive borrowing or money creation that reduces national income and production and threatens the livelihood of future generations. Tax rates and government regulations must not be so burdensome as to stifle the production of the very goods and services people need to live, right? Obviously, right? You've got to find balances that serve the people. Remember, though, that's the measure. Are the people being served? Are the people eating? Are the people given work? Are they living with dignity? Is sufficiency being met for the population, right? That's the measure, not is the private sector being hampered. We can hamper the private sector all we want as long as it furthers the sufficiency and the sustainability of livelihood for all. That's what we're looking for here. Okay, so sustaining the environment. We commit ourselves, we know about the climate crisis, we've already talked about it. We are committing to use less, to reuse, to recycle, and to restore natural resources. We are committing to plan for careful land use of church property and to receive and manage gifts of the land and real estate in sustainable ways. We call for appropriate policies and regulations that help reverse environmental destruction, for planning that accounts for the impact of regional growth on communities and ecosystems, for ending subsidies for economic activities that use up non-renewable natural resources. We call for companies to pay more fully for the wider social and environmental costs of what they produce, and the development and use of more energy efficient technologies. We need sustainable agriculture, right? This is obvious. We need to be able to grow food. Without it, the whole society will collapse. Without a bountiful and low-cost food supply, most Americans would not enjoy the livelihood they do. And farmers face the challenge of producing this food in ways that contribute to the regeneration of the land and the vitality of rural communities. At the same time, society as a whole must address the high levels of risk farmers face and the low prices they often receive. Changing agricultural policies and the growing power of large agribusiness corporations make this more challenging. So we as church commit to pray for and support those who farm the land and pursue new ways for consumers to partner with small farmers in sharing the risks and yields of farming. We call for changes to assure that farmers will receive a greater proportion of the retail food dollar. We call for adequate prices for agricultural products so that farmers can be compensated fairly for their labor and production costs. We call for sustainable agricultural practices that protect and restore the regenerative capacities of the land rather than practices that deplete the land. For example, by measuring productivity only by short-term agricultural yields. And we call for more just work conditions for farm workers, especially immigrants, and opportunities for them to acquire their own land, right? That last one is really important to me. And finally, we have a value for sustainable development of low-income communities, right? Instead of a top-down approach focused on a community's deprivation and its lack of economic growth, effective community development draws upon its assets and emphasizes quality and diverse production. Effective policies build and enhance community social relationships, values, and institutions, which together can further economic development. Local residents determine the future of their community by initiating, supporting, and sustaining new projects. Their capacities, skills, and assets help shape the vision and plan for the community. So we commit as a church and urge members to learn about, participate in, and provide financial support for community economic development and organizing strategies that enhance the current and future well-being of communities and the environment. We commit to support community development corporations and locally owned or producer-owned cooperatives, co-ops, you may have heard of them. We commit to integrate social values into our investment decisions and invest more in socially responsible companies and funds that sustain businesses as well as workers, consumers, the environment, and low-income communities. How much do you know about your church if you have stock options or stock investments? What companies are they in? Chances are very high that that is available to you as a member of your congregation. Check that out. Are you investing in Merrill Lynch? Are you investing in Mobil? Are you investing in, I don't know, I can't even think of a good international corporation. I wonder why that is. But see who your church has money in, who your church has a financial stake in, and why. And think about whether or not that makes sense given what we've heard in the statement about economic life. We also call as a church for support of the above strategies by governments, financial institutions, and the wider society, alternatives to gambling as a means of community economic development, right? Gambling is not helpful. Grants and low-interest loans that enable small companies and farms to get started, develop, and expand in order to provide livelihood for more people in low-income communities. All incredibly important things. Now, this is a lot of verbiage, and of course, I do recommend that you look at this economic justice social statement. But the point here is sustainability and sufficiency. Now, sufficiency means we're not acquiring stuff just to acquire stuff or to compete with each other. We're finding ways to provide for actually our neighbor what we need as God provides what we need for free, right? And so it's not about profiting off of our neighbor's need. It's about providing for our neighbor in ways that are sufficient and sustainable, and for everyone, especially the poor, a livelihood that is sufficient and sustainable and for all. So that's sufficiency and sustainability is, will the land be able to keep growing like this indefinitely? Will we be able to use the planet's resources at this rate? Are we damaging the environment? Are we harming communities such that they'll be destroyed? And I'll just tell a brief story here. And I'll say it generally. If you've ever been out into a town that's dying in the Midwest, right? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go right around the middle of Nebraska, and you'll find little tiny towns, probably originally farming communities predominantly, often having one, maybe two churches. Sometimes there aren't even numbers or street signs. These are communities that are falling apart, right? I went to one in Nebraska. I remember it vividly. It had this little town had 3 churches, 2 of which were Lutheran, 1 Roman Catholic. Hysterical. The town was about a square mile at most. There was 1 gas station, which was also the only grocery store. And the only other business that I remember being in the entire town was a restaurant that was also a casino. And that was where a lot of the money in town was. And that was where a lot of the entertainment was. It was the only place to get a good meal, and it was also where you went to gamble. And these folks, God bless them, are stuck there with this system that's not promoting their livelihood as best as we could. So I want to express that because this isn't just about oppressed populations, though it is, right? There's the concern for the immigrant. There's the concern for those who are discriminated against on basis of race and sex. There's also the fact that we as a nation have to work for our rural communities as well as our urban ones, both of which are being victimized by a lot of current practices that do not have their best interests at heart. How do we move forward from here? Well, first thing is we start living up as Christians to our witness that God has given us enough. And that enough is what we want for all. Enough for all, not all for us. And if we as Christians can systemically represent that in our politics and our lives, I think that will be one heck of a witness and a start to transforming the economic life of the United States in the 21st century. I hope that this has been interesting to you. Comments, questions, concerns? Pop them down in the comments. I really would like to read them and see what you're thinking, or how I can present this better or do this better. That's also helpful as well. Tomorrow, Sunday, and it'll be the 5th Sunday of Easter. There will be an appendix episode, as always, on Sunday, which is kind of just an optional thing, looking at something out of the Confessions. And then we'll resume on Monday with our 5th week of Church in the World. I hope you join me then. And until then, God bless.